How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
The cost and health burdens of electricity production have long been higher for low-income communities of color than for wealthy white ones. But when it comes to public engagement and trust, the oil and gas industry is often ahead of its clean energy competitors, presenting a friendly face to the same areas it supplies with jobs, tax dollars, and energy. Exploring those relationships today on Climate One are Derrick Hollie, president of Reaching America, Jacqueline Patterson, director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, Penn, energy reporter with the New York Times, and Vien Truong, director of climate justice for Tom Steyer PAC. And later, what would a radically re-envisioned future look like? All that today on Climate One.
And Penn, you've written that energy companies understood the importance of diversity before a lot of environmental groups did. Environmental groups kind of tend to come into these communities, often white, saying, hey, these companies are bad, they're killing the planet and you. But the energy companies have been there and recognized are more diverse and more part of that community. Penn?
The energy companies have to recognize that in order for them to get the political support that they need, they have to draw in a diverse group of people. So the idea of drawing in communities of color by funding not just the NAACP, but you see it's sort of prolific throughout communities of color, nonprofit organizations, to build a coalition. And in some cases, that has gone to the extreme of the the term now of astroturfing, the counter to grassroots movements, to try to build this diverse, at least a public perception of a diverse coalition in support of their projects. They also recognized, especially in the last decade, not only the diversification of their coalition, but that they've had to contend with something that they didn't anticipate, and in particular, solar power and its effects on all energy, how it is changing both the utility sector, how it's affecting the transportation sector and the need to electrify. When you start looking at the diversification of the energy sources, then they're having to evaluate their whole business model. How do we contend with all of these things that 100 years ago, when we offered universal electric service, when transportation automobiles became a core part of our transportation system, it didn't anticipate all these different types of things, people delivering power to the electric grid, not needing gasoline and instead driving an electric vehicle. These are things that they hadn't anticipated. And so they've needed to diversify for their own survival.
Vien Truong, in 2016, Hillary Clinton offered a $30 billion plan to help coal workers. Often that was focused on retraining. We hear a lot about retraining. You've been involved in green jobs. Does that really ever happen? We hear about it, but does it ever really happen?
I think, well, that's a big question. Does it really happen? Sure, in different pockets and specificity. What I would look back at the 30 billion is it needed to be unpacked about where was the money going to be spent and how this transition was going to work, with a lot more specificity needed, and making sure that we're working with people who are in those industries to look at what is a real rational plan that's not very abstract, that's looking at, for folks who are in the older tiers ready to retire, what does that look like for the transition, right? What does it look like to make sure that you continue to have the benefits you need, the pension that you had, and making sure that you have the safety net for your family? And oftentimes, in the previously there was a single person household that's carrying the weight, the economic weight of the whole family on this one income. and making sure that the family is protected. And if there's if people are kind of in the middle tier, how do we make sure that they have the right skill set? What kind of industries do they have in the nearby vicinity that they can actually get connected to with a reasonably level amount of wages and the same kind of corresponding benefits? And then for the younger folks, how do we make sure that we're continuing to get them kind of directed at cleaner jobs or better jobs? And how do we make sure that the whole of the community actually has other options and economic diversity for other places to work besides just your fossil fuel industries? And that's where I think that 30 billion could have been better unpacked and kind of brought in folks who are proximate to the problem or proximate to what's going on to help design the solutions. And I think that's the learning lesson that we have here. How do we make sure that, you know, whether you're working at a very local level or at the federal level, that we don't do things in a vacuum or in silos? We are now more interconnected than ever before. We have to start bringing in folks to help make sure that we're creating solutions that make sense for everybody, right? You can't create solutions. I mean, for a long time, you know, my family's refugee folks from Vietnam. For a long time, policy is done to people and not with people. And now we're at a place where we understand that we have to make sure that we are not only creating a seat at the table for people who are proximate to the problem, but bring the table to the community that you're trying to create policies that actually affect and make sure that they're co-creating the solutions with us, you know, with the policymakers, with the different folks who are actually helping to shape the future so that we can design something that makes sense with all the stakeholders involved.
Ivan Penn, I'd like to talk to you about, you know, this jobs transition. People hear about that, like, you know, what are coal miners going to do? But the jobs in clean energy are very different types of jobs, often in a very different place.
That's right. You're talking about a significant difference in pay, where you are going from nuclear jobs, which are obviously very high-paying jobs. A reactor, you could have 600 people at a plant, whereas, you know, a solar farm, after it's built, I mean, you essentially have a guy with a squeegee. And so, I mean, those are real issues. You have a lot of jobs created in the development and installation of solar and wind, but you don't have as many as the fossil fuel and other big box power plants. There is a lot of training that companies have been providing in this transition. But you know, recently wrote a story about some of the competition between renewables and natural gas now. And there was a power plant closed in North Dakota, Underwood, North Dakota, and the utility was switching to wind and natural gas from coal. That is a devastating decision to the small town there that depended on not only the power plant, but also the coal mine that supplied that power plant. And now that town is wondering, well, what are we going to do? And the other nearby small towns. So, you know, there are some real issues. And the question is, how does the country navigate the transition that increasingly all parties are embracing in order to deal with climate change?
Jackie Patterson, I was an internet reporter in the early days of the internet, and the thinking then was that it was going to democratize information, that there were going to be so many sources of information, lots of competition, this sort of moving away from centralization of, you know, IBM and mainframe computers. Now we have a situation where a handful of large companies dominate the internet. That democratization didn't happen. And I hear similar, that echoes for me some of the conversations about distributed power is going to be more democratic, and people, you can, you know, give power to the people from their rooftops. I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of the concentration and distribution of power as we move from a fossil economy to a cleaner economy. We might have a replay of the same story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is kind of to some of the points that were being made before. We started this initiative called the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition, so that we really make sure that we are centering the voices of people who are standing to lose their livelihoods in this transition. And in that conversation with the Black labor folks in the lead, we've been talking about how currently the centralized power has resulted in circumstances such as the 76,000 coal miners that have lost their lives since 1968, while the National Mining Association, which consisted of the very companies that employed them, fought against the regulations to be able to protect them from the coal mine dust that is tied to the black lung disease that took their lives, and that's in counting. And so we've talked about how not only is the lobbying against those types of regulations, but it's also a number of these fossil fuel companies are paying into groups like ALEC that push forward on everything from school and prison privatization to water privatization to even voter suppression laws. And so that centralization of power and the lack of real people engagement and what is in that agenda and for our communities, it's at the expense of the well-being of our communities, points to us for the need of decentralizing the wealth and the power that's driving that machine. And so for us, it is and in the context of the conversation with the Black Labor Initiative, it's really talking about how do we what are the possibilities, not just thinking of trading a job in doing coal or oil and gas for another energy job, or even, but what are the vast possibilities in the new economy that we're trying to transition to. And so, and in each of the sectors of this new economy, we have a lot of folks who are pushing for decentralization, because whether it's people getting their electricity shut off for non-payment while the company that's responsible for it has a CEO making $9.8 million a year, and you're cutting somebody off for $60 to literally at the cost of their lives. Our report Lights Out in the Coal talked about people who were burning candles for electricity after having for light after having their electricity cut off, and burned down their houses. So they literally paid the price of poverty with their lives.
Derrick Hollie, your grandfather was a coal miner, and a lot of your writings, you cite the Heritage Foundation as an authoritative source. I wonder what you think about the prospect of coal in America. Is it going to come back, as Donald Trump claims?
No, I don't think there's going to be a comeback with the coal. I just don't. For a couple of different reasons. One, like we talked, coal, I've watched it because my grandfather was a black coal miner in Southwest Virginia. And I've seen right now coal represents about 28, 29% of our entire energy mix. And I've seen it decline over the years. When I started this thing, Reaching America, about 5 or 6 years ago, coal was up to like 34, 35%. And just in 5, 6 years, it's gone down to 29, 28%. And I think we're going to continue to see that decrease in coal for one reason. One, because natural gas is cleaner, it's more efficient, we have it in abundance. And so while I think coal will continue to decrease in terms of our electric mix and energy supply goes, I think coal will always be around because we still need it for different materials, i.e. windmills, solar panels, and that kind of thing, that will still keep coal in place, but not to the level where it is right now. I had the opportunity to go back to Southwest Virginia and visit where my grandfather was a coal miner. And that area still 50 years later has never rebounded. And you talk about poverty in the Appalachia, it is so different from that in an urban city. Like I said, I lost count of the number of homes the roofs were damaged, and they just had a blue tarp on the top of it with tires holding it down because they couldn't afford to get their roofs fixed. And poverty, like I said, just runs rampant in Appalachia. It's because of the loss of the coal mines there, and they tried to replace some of those jobs by opening prisons. That's not the answer either. But it's going to be very difficult as we continue with some of these proposals that are being put forth right now that are trying to eliminate oil and gas jobs. I just wonder, how do you retrain a workforce who's at their golden years, almost to the end of retirement? Where does that money come from for them? And so that's why I just say we just need to hold on, pump our brakes as we transition to renewables. Just make sure that everyone is taken care of in our effort as we continue to do that.
Science has given us a realistic picture of what Earth will look like with unmitigated climate change, increased extreme weather events, crippled economies, and a world where those with the least are hit the hardest. What solutions do we need to replace doom and gloom projections with thriving cities, renewed political consciousness, and carbon-free economies? A conversation with climate journalist Eric Holthaus and strategist Catherine Wilkinson on reimagining climate solutions. Eric, I'd like to begin with the grief that many people are feeling right now. You write about solastalgia, which I had to look up in the dictionary. What is that, and how do you cope with it?
Yeah, I feel like the original definition was coined by Glenn Albrecht, who is a Australian philosopher, and he explored the sort of intersectional, far-ranging implications of the fossil fuel industry in rural Australia. Talking with communities over long periods of time there. And the one sort of theme that sort of stood out most to him was this sense of loss of their surroundings, of what it means to call a place home, because the place had so utterly transformed that it wasn't, it was the same place, but it wasn't at all the same place. So it's sort of this nostalgia, this longing for a place that is no longer the place that you remember or recognize. And that is sort of, I think, happening at a global level now when we think about climate. We recognize the seasons, we recognize our surroundings, but we also feel like something is very wrong, like in a sort of deep way that many of us really struggle to articulate. I know I do. But then when you add the science on top of it, say it's only going to get worse from here, especially if we don't do anything about it, then it becomes sort of an existential crisis, or a not really being able to feel at home in your own lived experience. And that is, I think, what I would say everyone is trying to work through right now, regardless of whether or not we're able to really articulate it.
The deep longing for the natural world that we know is never coming back.
Mhm.
Eric, I recall vividly your 2018 article that was titled "Climate Change Blues," and remembering thinking, I'm not the only one who talks about climate depression with a therapist. You wrote that one way to deal with climate depression is admitting our personal limitations. Does that mean that an individual can't save the world?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, but it means that we need to start asking a lot of questions about if our mindset is saving the world, then I think that we need to have a lot of sort of thought and conversation about who we're saving it for, and what work we're doing to either advance or detract from that goal. And really, I feel like the only answer is that we have to do this work together, that everyone has a role, that we're all at least some part responsible and have the ability to make radical changes in our lives. So definitely the responsibility for climate change itself as a phenomenon is very unequal, and I think that that sort of understanding where we fit into that, and knowing that that doesn't have to define you. You don't have to sort of internalize the guilt and the feeling of inadequacy of moving forward. Like, everyone is possible. We choose every day to continue along our daily routines, and those routines can change at any time. And it's easier to change those routines if we're doing it together in a supportive community.
Catherine Wilkinson, in your TED Talk that it has almost 2 million views, you said, quote, "To have eyes wide open is to hold a broken heart every day. It's a grief that I rarely speak." End of quote. How are you holding that grief now as we see the breakdown of COVID and climate all around us? You said that a broken heart is awake.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a lot, right? I not just for climate, but for so many of the harms and sort of affronts to life, right, that unfold around our world every day. I mean, to take all of that in, to like really let it into your being. I don't know how to not have a broken heart. And so I think there's this very subtle but significant difference between just being brokenhearted. But a broken open heart, I think, is incredibly powerful. At least for me, that's not something that I can sustain alone. It really means coming into community of kind of fellow broken hearts, and having that space to grieve. Sometimes it's interesting what I see in the climate solutions communication space is kind of like railroading over all of the feels, right, that people are understandably bringing to this moment. And I think we need space to feel those things. And I think it's only kind of going through the depth of feeling that we come back into a space of courage. And that's just a cycle that repeats.
Eric, you write about the difference between courage and hope when you quote Kate Marvel, who's a scientist, saying the courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. And so much of the conversation around climate is, I want to know if my action's going to have an impact. I want to know if there's hope, because if there isn't hope, why should I inconvenience myself? Why should I change? Why should I incur some cost? So talk about the difference between courage and hope.
Yeah, I think I think hope is what happens when you deny that there is fear. If you are working on climate expecting everything to be okay because of your actions, and you don't feel that fire, both in terms of anger and energy and fear and all those red emotions that are sort of propelling you throughout the day that you need to recover from and recharge from. If you're not feeling that, then I think that you probably don't have a full or maybe you've blocked part of that in your head somehow. And I think that's where we get into the hope narratives of saying, if you just pour a bunch of, venture capital into this, then we're going to fix the world. There's no silver bullet here. You're not going to have a magical solution to this problem, because the problem itself is like how we've structured society. So I think courage is understanding that it's hard work that we're doing and that we're up against the odds, and that actually the odds are not good, that we will do what we need to do, but we have to do it anyway. And for a lot of us, we have no choice but to do this work. People that are already on the front lines of change, people that have already lost loved ones in climate disasters, people who have been marginalized for hundreds of years by the systems that are sort of perpetuating the climate emergency. Those people have no choice but to do this work.
There's a lot of science that's come out that has been very scary and dark, and I think that the climate narrative is inherently scary because of the science, and the science is even watered down and is somewhat less dramatic than the peer-reviewed science is often more conservative than the actual reality. But Catherine Wilkinson, is the climate narrative inherently scary, or is that a fossil fuel company trope that they're trying to sell us?
I think that if you're not scared, you're probably not awake, right? In some significant way. But I think the question is, what do we do, right? Are the feelings of fear or grief, are those the ending feelings, right? Or do we actually find our way, maybe not through those, but sort of moving forward with those feelings in tow. And so I think it's that question of engagement and of moving forward, that there are a lot of interests, right, in seeing us wallow, right? That would be great, if all of these climate caring humans just sort of wallowed in grief, and stayed paralyzed by fear. That would be a helpful thing, right, for us to do, from some perspectives. And so I think the point that Eric makes in this book is so critical, that there is still an opening. And so how do we mourn and imagine, right? How do we feel fear and feel determination? Maybe most of all, how do we link arms and keep each other going? Because we're probably not going to have the fire in the belly ourselves every day, but in community, you can rely on each other and feed off each other. And I think that's why that notion of having an ecosystem of all these different people and entities and organizations that are involved in this great transformation effort is so critical, because I don't know anyone who can show up in full cape hero mode every day, right? And some days, the best thing, maybe it's hold the space for the hard feelings, and then we get back into motion together. And that there's a dialectic, I think, between sort of the emotional experience that we're all in, and we're so much more connected to the living systems of this planet than we've been taught to think that we are, right? I do think that we can feel what's happening in the systems of life. Let's get into strategy mode, and think about how we're going to take apart what's not working, and build something new and beautiful in its place.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. I'm Greg Dalton. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.